so my skeptical mind, and that's just who I am. My skeptical mind goes to, well, yeah, of course, you've got this guy over here that's logical and reasonable, and you got this guy over here that's wearing a tinfoil hat. Of course, the tinfoil hat guy's gonna see a lot of stuff, right? He's like imagining it, or he's watched one too many sci-fi movies.
But it's used to help us frame hypotheses for UFO propulsion, power, stealth, weaponry.
Everything that we experience is very positive.
Sometimes the field of ufology has a short memory span.
We didn't know anything about the $22 million back then. We just kind of thought, well, this is, and I think that was the reason why they were looking for military-type people, because in the military, you work with whatever you got, no matter what the situation is. You just kind of adapt and overcome.
Well, happy Friday, everyone. This is Erica Lukes. I am always happy to be here. And, of course, it is with kind of great sadness tonight that we are all here after the startling events of what took place at the Capitol this week. And I want to just give a shout out to a friend that I have back there who's a journalist who has been right in the thick of things and has witnessed things that have just been very stupefying, very saddening to him. And I wish him the best, and all of the other journalists that are back there trying to get us information about what's taking place. I also want to just say that I'm very proud that UFO Classified is a show that does not support Q Anon and very dangerous rhetoric and conspiracy theories. I feel this is very important to really come out and say, because there is so much of this, unfortunately, that is embroiled in the UFO community, and that is just simply not a good or healthy thing. As my show progresses, as I learn more about different things, I want to bring on people that have something of merit. And sometimes I bring on people that, of course, we're not going to talk about UFOs for 2 hours, because, as I said, the more I learn, the more important it is for me to share with you what I've learned and to put together pieces of the puzzle, because ufology isn't black and white. There are a lot of players that go that are involved in this. There's a lot of deceit, and it's much bigger than I'd ever imagined. And my guest is going to talk with me about that tonight, because he has been through his own personal journey, and we'll just see how that aligns. I want to give a shout out to all of my friends in chat. Sue, I hope you're feeling better. Northern UFOs, thank you for everything. Cyrus, Ken, we've all been through a great deal as of late, and you really mean the world to me. You are the reason that I'm here. I love doing this, and I won't stop. As much as they'd like to, pick me to do that, but that's okay. We won't go anywhere. I'm here tonight with a friend of mine, and we've actually known each other since high school, and no, we're not going to tell you when that was, because I'm still pretending I'm much younger than I am. Patrick Lovell is a producer and writer, and he is known for Dark Matter, which he did back in 2007, Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream in 2014, and he recently released a 5-part documentary called The Con, and I hope all of you watch that, because it is a very important show about his own personal journey and what he uncovered with regard to fraudulent practices with the home loan mortgage crisis, credit card debt, student loans, auto loans, all of these things that took place between finance, government, that affected all of our lives. And as we know now, we're currently going through something quite similar. But as I said, as I go through this learning process with UFOs, I am really, I guess, not too surprised to see that some of the same names are coming up in all of this. And so I just want to say, Patrick, thanks for coming on the show. This is really cool, and it's fun because we've known each other forever.
Eric, I am so pleased to be joining you. I'm a huge fan of yours. And of course, like you mentioned, we've been friends for literally decades now. Oh, well, I shouldn't say that, because of course we're younger than we are. But, yeah, it's a great honor to be hanging out with you. I think the stuff that you do is so important and really incredible to listen to. So Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's been interesting to see how, we've crossed paths again, and we both have similar interests, and you have, a diehard interest like I do in UFOs and paranormal things, and it'll be fun to talk about that a little bit later because I love hearing your stories. They're really pretty incredible. But I also am very interested to start to know, for the audience to know about your process and what you've been through the past decade and how that led you on this really incredible learning process. And you found out some things that have probably, shattered your reality, but you're getting them out there, and I have to commend you. That's really cool.
I'm sorry, I muted myself accidentally. I really appreciate that, Erica. I've always prided myself on being aware and being very involved with the world that I habitat. So, as long as I can remember, I've been aware of how the world operates: power, history, the vortex of people's energy, politics, that sort of thing. I studied politics in college, and in many ways, I've always been an activist, but particularly just in terms of kind of the ebbs and flows of how power actually operates. And I've always had just an incredible fascination and interest. History has always fascinated me. So I've always found myself very principled, very committed to truth, very committed to the processes of understanding how systems operate. And because I am somewhat of a student of history, I'm always on the lookout for things that don't add up. I've never really trusted power. I kind of feel like I'm very much an American in that refrain. But from the standpoint of, understanding how what we've heard throughout our lives, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And, corruption is really the scary thing. I've seen millions of horror movies. I've seen a lot of crazy things in my personal life. And to give you an example, like probably one of the only films that really truly terrified me was a film with Denzel Washington back in the 90s, and it was called Training Day. And he was a corrupt LA cop. And you think of yourself in certain situations, throughout your life, and you're like, God, how does anybody survive a corrupt cop, right? They're going to target you, and they're going to plant stuff on you, and they're going to put you in a place that you can't get out of. They've got the upper hand, and it's not something that, I would ever want to face, right? And so, from that kind of perspective, as I had kind of moved through my progression in life, really, I had thought that I'd seen it all, but I really didn't know the half of it, to be honest with you.
That's the crazy thing. It's like you and I we had great childhoods. We were very fortunate with our lives. We've had wonderful things, and then we've both been through pretty traumatic losses where everything that we've had has been kind of ripped out from underneath us. And I think that seems to be kind of going around right now. Everybody I talk to is going through this big crisis where everything is being just stripped away. And it is it takes a lot to move through that and to do it in a graceful fashion. And when you're talk a little bit, let's go back to, and I wanted actually, before we get into your, what happened to you to really put you on your knees and to get you to the point where you're making this incredible documentary and trying to find answers. Give me your feedback on what happened in Washington, D.C. over this past week.
Well, first, let me address what I appreciate you saying, that a lot of people feel like they've had the rug removed from underneath them recently. I'd like to know more about what that constitutes. But, the stuff that's happening in D.C., particularly 2 days ago, with the MAGA raid on the Capitol, like I've said all throughout social media the last few days, whoever didn't see that coming has got to be insanely clueless. And I'm speaking specifically to the mainstream media because out of the corner of my eye, I'd see, posts on social media, YouTube, you name it, that showed Proud Boys all over Washington, D.C., Proud Boys in Trump's hotel. I saw it here, there, everywhere. You look back at the last 6 months of the type of stuff that was going on during the Black Lives Matter campaign, particularly in, was it Kenosha, Wisconsin? Maybe I got the wrong name in Wisconsin, but Portland, Oregon, Washington, D.C. I mean, we saw unmarked paramilitary forces in all of those towns. And, I started looking into that, and the first thing that popped into my head was like Eric Prince and Blackwater. And so for anybody that's not aware of that, Eric Prince is the brother of billionaires. Betsy DeVos is the Secretary of Education in Trump's cabinet. And they made their money through basically Amway, right? Multi-level marketing kind of stuff. But in either case, very conservative people. And, Eric Prince created this Blackwater mercenary force, really, that was guns for hire back in the Iraq War, involved with just incredible stuff that was both insanely bad, and I'm sure probably plenty of good too, depending on who you ask under what circumstances. I know they were involved with some major stuff that was happening in Fallujah as well. But I remember a few years ago, Eric Prince being involved with some conversations that were happening in Cyprus, involved with none other than Wilbur Ross. Now, the interesting component about that is Wilbur Ross is probably one of the top flight vulture capitalists of this country. He plays in big time into my investigations and my storyline, what we're going to talk about soon. But they were both in Cyprus a few years ago, and they were involved with a lot of scenarios that kind of painted a picture of like this, I would call it an intersection of money laundering that was coming out of Russia, maybe the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, and some others through some banks that Wilbur Ross was involved with. And I think a lot of that sort of money was being laundered into the United States, and there's a lot of things that happen along those lines, and I'll get into that as well downstream. But there's a term that I want you to be aware of. It's called FinCEN. These are the FinCEN files through the through the Treasury. FinCEN reports are these breaches of red flags that basically Treasury reports to the Department of Justice of strange occurrences happening within financial transactions. And a lot of times this could be like drug cartels or oligarchs from other countries like Saudi Arabia, maybe Russia, so forth, moving a lot of money into our financial institutions. And a lot of this stuff is tied to some really bad things that could be, for example, international terrorism. So we've been in a very weird place for literally decades now. And, I know a lot of your listeners are probably aware of CIA actions throughout countries, particularly following World War II, right? South America comes to mind, among others. And ultimately, this stuff with Eric Prince was just really weird to me because, here are these monies baked into the system that these guys are close to Trump. Wilbur Ross ends up becoming, Commerce Secretary. And this guy's up to no good in every direction. And so you ask about this question about, what do I know about what happened at the Capitol yesterday? Well, other than what I saw, like everybody else saw, that I saw coming a mile away. And I basically, my jaw dropped, Erica, watching mainstream media, which I tend to do nightly just to see what they're talking about and how they position certain things. And it could be Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. It could be Anderson Cooper or Don Lemon on CNN. And then, of course, the whole cadre of folks on Fox. And it's fun to just kind of, actually, I find myself very entertained watching how they parse things in the way that they do because, it's their business model, quite frankly. But it seemed to me like a lot of folks were incredibly surprised by what happened. And I'm like, how much do you get paid? What do you get paid for? How completely clueless are you? And see, the way that plays in, and I think a lot of it is, plays into the stuff that we're probably going to get into. It's like, think about PSYOPs, right?
Right.
In ufology and, misdirection and confusion. And you mentioned up top QAnon. I mean, all of this stuff is psychological distraction, but in a lot of ways fermented in very, very top flight calibrated ways with a lot of firepower behind them, whether it's monetary. So, for example, I'll take it one step further with Wilbur Ross and Eric Prince. They're in the consortium of the Mercers. Who are the Mercers? Billionaire tech people. What were they involved with prior to all of this stuff going down? especially in the 2016 election? Well, obviously, many people call it Russiagate, but it was Cambridge Analytica. There's ways that high tech can be used to manifest confusion, so doubts, distraction. And, you know, one of the things that, one of the truisms that Churchill had pontificated is not the right word, contemplated, was when he expressed to the world that a lie gets around the world faster than the truth can get. A lie travels around the world faster than the truth gets its pants on. So here we are.
You know, I like that. And you mentioned, and I want to just bring this up because to me it has been really fascinating again to connect the UFO community and that mindset with some of the larger things that are going on. And I find it fascinating. I just learned that Red McCombs was co-owner of Clear Channel Communications, which owned Coast to Coast for a time. And he was involved with Blackwater along with John Ashcroft and Bobby Ray Inman. And so to see that
he also owned the Minnesota Vikings. That's interesting.
Yes, yeah.
I didn't know he was involved with Blackwater. Interesting.
Yeah. So like I said, it's just all of this. I'm learning things, and then I'm seeing the programming that we've seen on Coast to Coast, and the fact that they're involving. You know, as I look back on it now, it's like a lot of religious aspects and the Nephilim and some of these things that are so far out there, and then this really kind of this very concerning rhetoric, and I view it as kind of the beginnings of the Q Anon mentality as I look back on it.
Let me take it back to QAnon, though, which is really another sort of, depending on if you could see my face if we were on video, like a grin, you know, like a different dimension of my grin can reflect like 1,000 different things, right? And, you know, I'm like smiling when I think about QAnon from this perspective. So the origins of QAnon are incredible. They came out of Citigroup. So why would that be? Why would QAnon come out of Citigroup?
Well,
what is Citigroup, by the way? First of all, what is Citigroup, Erica? Not to put you on the spot, but this is kind of conversation, you know, compartmentalized that'll lead us down the path of what, you know, unfortunately I'm an expert in, but go ahead.
No, you go ahead because you are the expert and this is your bag.
So they were doing, they were hired by the Koch Foundation, the Koch Brothers, some sort of segment of the Koch brother Foundation. And Koch Brothers, of course, are billionaires. They're super involved with the fossil fuel industry and many other things like mining and paper and textiles. Just one of the biggest fortunes in the United States. And the Koch brothers started off making their fortune with their father, Fred Koch, and none other than the Soviet Union. Fred Koch built the infrastructure for Stalin's oil infrastructure, which to this day is probably the second largest reserves on the planet, particularly down in the Caspian arena. And so the Koch brothers were born multi-millionaires. And it's interesting because they're libertarians. And but yet probably the single biggest influence of their lives was Stalin. And what did Stalin do? Well, Stalin murdered millions upon millions upon millions of people, and he built an oligarchy around him, you know. And so a lot of people out there, particularly libertarians, are super anti-communist. But isn't it funny that the ultimate libertarians got their start, headwinds, and success from the ultimate communist? And the reason I paint that picture is because there's really no difference when you get into the isms, whether it's fascism, communism, whatever ism, if it's corrupt. Corruption is what corruption is. It's centrifugal force and power, which is information and disinformation, which is what the topic of our conversation is. So with regards to Citigroup, the Koch enterprises had hired Citigroup to gather data on all of their, their members, people that had accounts at Citigroup across a wide swath, and basically just gathered information on their customers. And in so doing, we're able to aggregate all sorts of data about who they were, what they do, what they think, how they operate, what they purchase. It's the same old when it comes down to, you know, the tech operations, right? So we live in this era where, you know, the big thing today really are tech giants, monopolies, Google, Facebook, any other sort of consortium, Cambridge Analytica, all these are data triggers. So what happens is these guys mine information based on what we do, what we follow, how we operate. There was a great documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, and it spells it out. These guys, these tech guys, these software engineers get as much information and data on what we respond to, and their job is to keep us interested in what we respond to. And so if they start to create a data point and they can map out what we're going to respond to, they can keep our attention longer, and then they can feed us what we're going to fall into. And if we get on that gerbil wheel and we keep spinning, they're going to keep giving us more and more information. Hence, that's how they developed QAnon to begin with.
And that is so important, and I've been trying to stress this in each of my shows as of late, because this is really, I can see this happen in a little level in the UFO community. It's like or the New Age community. I mean, you're getting all of these, people are finding out what makes you tick, and then they're just giving you more of the same and amping you up and learning how to manipulate you and make you angry, make you, take your pitchfork to the street and do things that you never would have thought you would have done, in your right mind, which you shouldn't have, and it's fascinating to me. And I look back, again, I say the UFO community is just such a nice little microcosm of all of this that's happening. And I've got this a catalog in here that I've got in my archive, and it's from 1995, and it's entitled Lightworks Audio and Video Tools for Expanding Your Mind. And here you have, all these things about nutrition and managing your weight, and then using sound to retrain your mind, and quantum healing, and, all of these things, and acupuncture, and then you've got some very interesting political and religious things coming in there that might be a little sketchy to me. And so here you've got, back in 95, they were manipulating, whoever they is, manipulating the community, the New Age community, the health and wellness community, and the UFO community. And that has created the perfect storm that we saw on Wednesday.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, it's history and it's humanity. We're pretty simple beings, quite frankly. I mean, we live in a capitalist, system, and the old adage is give the people what they want, And so when we grew up with, television and radio and newsprint, I mean, they all did the exact variation of these. We've just gotten better and more attuned and more immediate, and there's just more data. So, it's like I always, it's pretty easy to, pick me out in a lineup, like I could be a rude boy, ska boy back in the 80s listening to the English Beat and the Specials, and I skateboard and I read Playboy magazine and I go to, punk shows, right? So if you feed me all that stuff, I'm going to take the bait, right? And so, and I think about it, and I think about all the stuff that happened throughout our lifetimes. I mean, just think about what people were addicted to in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and that's all it is, man. It's like, people get in tune with what they're in tune with, and hopefully as you get older, you get a little bit more wise and a little bit wider berth and bandwidth, if you will, to be more aware of how things operate. And quite frankly, though, it really is on point that when we think about ufology and, this intersection of kind of our conversations, I have always been interested in the unexplained since I had an experience like so many of your listeners back in, for me, it was 1991. I was in Sedona, Arizona. I was hanging out with my buddy Nate Lazar. We were doing some rock climbing in this place called the Wagon Wheel Vortex. And I was aware of all sorts of really trippy things that were happening in Sedona because it's a major cultural thing, Red Rocks, and there's a lot of energy. And it kind of has that cross section of the stuff you were talking about with spirituality and some of these other things. And I used to frequent the place quite a bit when I was in college because I went to Arizona State. And I'll never forget, I was there, we're rock climbing, we're hanging out. It was a beautiful night, just an extraordinary sunset. It was as red as the Red Rocks. And, that kind of arena just always uplifted me. And I remember seeing this strange white light that was seemingly right above my head. I couldn't make it out. It felt like I was looking at possibly a planet, something else, but then it kind of changed some colors on me, but it was kind of a white light, and yet it made no sound, and it was just there. And so I tugged at my buddy, Nate, and I said, "Hey man, are you seeing what I'm seeing?" He's like, "Yeah, dude." And next thing I know, we're sitting on top of this rock and we're just scoping it out, and it's just there, and we can't put our finger on it, right? And so we're like, okay, well, it's not threatening, and we don't know what it is. Are we seeing something? And it doesn't make sense. It's just like this spot that we're both in tune with. So, whatever. We go and hop in my car. We drive down the canyon, and it was equidistant over our car the whole ride down the canyon. And I'm like, what is this, right? And so my buddy and I are cruising down to Phoenix, which is about an hour and a half drive from Sedona. And we were roommates also, and we were just heading back. And I remember about, maybe another 40 minutes into the drive, and, we're listening to tunes and, just kind of checked out. And I just happened to look up because I was trying to avoid this thing because I couldn't figure it out. It made no sense, and it was kind of making me a little crazy, to be honest with you. And then all of a sudden, this thing made this vertical jet in like a hyper second, right? I mean, it just split to the heavens. And I was like, dude, what was that? I literally pulled over on the side of the road. Nate and I got out, and we talked about it for a while, and we couldn't put our finger on it, but we both saw it. And so not too much longer later, I think that was 91. It was about 1997. Suddenly the Phoenix lights happened, right? And all of a sudden I was like, whoa, that's a trip. And then many years later, of course, all the stuff happened on YouTube, and I started seeing the stuff, and I was like, yeah, that looks a lot like what I saw. And then, of course, I started tapping into Ancient Aliens and the rest. And, I'm a Star Wars kid, right? I mean, it's like we lived. I remember going to, you might remember this. I went to the University of Utah to this wonderful, I'm trying to think of what discipline of science he was in. He had this summer study at the University of Utah, and he had this calculation of how many known planets there were in our galaxy. And he did the math, and it was just extraordinary, the likelihood of life, whether or not it was intelligent life. It was just like extremely high percentages, right? And I've always been of the mindset, yeah, of course, the universe is just so incredibly beyond our comprehension. How is it that we're the only life forms in the entire universe? To me, it was ridiculous to think that, we were the center of the universe and the only life forms that existed. So I've always been of that mindset, and, when you start to dig into it over the years, you start to go, oh, wait a second.
I mean, it is such a fascinating subject. And I mean, I've always been, ever since I was a little kid, I picked up a book on the library shelf and was mesmerized by the flying saucer that I saw and mesmerized by Bigfoot and all of these unexplainable things. And it's been such a trip for me because, in high school, I was very, I fancied myself a little hippie, kind of new agey thing. And that's when crystals were really big, and we were, meditation and all of this stuff, and communion came out. Well, maybe not to date myself, but anyway, I kind of just did. But, seeing the, Communion by Whitley Strieber and seeing the cover of The Gray Alien. And then, between that and Close Encounters, you've got this mass push to ingrain that little gray alien in our subconscious and stuff. But it's been a fascinating ride. And I fully believe that we can't be the only thing that is here around us in the universe. I mean, if that's the case, then that's a little sad.
Well, and I know we've had these conversations a few times, and that's why I'm so just tickled to be talking to you about it on your show tonight, because I've just always been fascinated. I want to produce a television show with you at the helm, taking us around the world and really delving deep into a lot of the stuff that you've uncovered, because I know you are connected around the world, and you're super, super high functioning in this space. You're an expert and somebody a lot of people pay attention to. And I want to learn so much more. I'm so open to the nature of cover-ups, because there's so much that just seems so obvious, especially if you experience it, right? Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So Close Encounters of the Third Kind is really pretty much, not to get off topic here, but wanted to create some correlations, and I think this is the jumping off point because ultimately, I was Richard Dreyfuss building the Devil Tower in my kitchen by way of what took place during after the collapse of the great financial crisis in 2008. So before that, I've been a television producer for a long time. I've worked at the highest levels of media. I started off in Los Angeles after college, and I had the great opportunity to work on the lots of Warner Brothers and Paramount for some heavy hitter executive producers. So I'd been around the real game, right? I mean, I went pretty far. I was a small fish in a big pond, but I was on the lots, right? And I was around these giant productions, one of which happened to be Men in Black, incidentally. My executive producer that I worked for was Men in Black, and all sorts of interesting things, right? And, I'd always paid attention, for example, to, and I was a big fan of Steven Spielberg films, or at least several of them. And I kept thinking to myself, especially after I started doing some research, like decades after the fact, how in the world is Steven Spielberg so in front of what seems to be the wake of what some of the themes of his films are, whether it's Close Encounters or, quite frankly, Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull? You find out many, many years later that there's all these like schools of thought that his research team obviously had information on. And it almost felt to me, quite frankly, Erica, that a guy like Spielberg was getting his information from somebody, right? That he was building these fictional depictions
Absolutely.
And sometimes life is stranger than fiction. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I kept thinking, and by the way, Spielberg, by the way, is from Arizona too. So I wouldn't be surprised if he was hanging out, on the back door of his house, looking up at the heavens and saw some strange things in the desert. I don't know what it is. Tell me, why is the desert seemingly so vibrant for ufology?
I just think because there's not a lot around, so you don't have a lot of witnesses. So if you want to make things up, then it happened to the desert. I'm just kidding. I don't know. I mean, other than the fact I think of, being in New Mexico and looking up at the sky and just seeing every star and just being, I think there's a connectedness to the universe when you're in an environment like that.
Can I ask you a silly question?
Yeah.
Every time I see, pictures or depictions of the Greys, they don't have a lot of hair. Do you think they might be drawn to warm climate?
I have never really thought about that one before. That's interesting.
I don't know, man. When I started watching Ancient Aliens, what really got me, because I think Ancient Aliens is so funny. It's it's one of my, God, what is the term when it's just, I love just checking out to watching Ancient Aliens throughout the years, like on a Friday night. Yeah, I might be having cocktails late when the family's in bed. And I'll watch Ancient Aliens and most of the shows I think are ridiculous, but some of them are like, holy crap, does that make a lot of sense, right? I'll never forget the first time I learned that the perimeters of the Giza pyramid and the Sun Pyramid down in whatever that place is in central Mexico are pretty much exact, as are the layouts with regards to oh God, I don't want to say the Pleiades, or do I? That's how they're. I think that isn't that the whole point of those pyramids? Both the Great Pyramids of Egypt and Central Mexico, aren't they oriented to? Oh God, why can't I think of the star constellation?
The Pleiades.
The Pleiades.
Yeah, right.
And then they claim that that's like kind of the birthplace of our solar system, maybe. Anyway, whatever. I always found that kind of stuff incredibly compelling, incredibly fascinating, right? And then, of course, all the stuff that came down later, and I know we can kind of, hear your clarity on some of the stuff that's since been with the guys on Netflix. But I will say, even though I can't think of their names, that are correlated to the Navy pilot in the New York Times revelations, especially in 2004, of quite frankly similar objects that I saw in Sedona that seemingly were doing the same thing with the Navy's pilot, whose name eludes me at the moment.
Mm-hmm. The Tic Tac, the Nimitz.
Yeah, the Nimitz, but it wasn't the Tic. Yeah, exactly. And all of that stuff. But the more information. I'm telling you, when I started seeing stuff on YouTube that was exactly what I saw from around the world, I'm like, okay, come on, what the hell is this, right? And then you start delving into it, and you start seeing all of these other things that you and I have talked about off show for some time, some of which have a lot more credibility than others, as you've expressed to me. So I don't want to embarrass myself and kind of get myself stuck in a jam of maybe talking about something that doesn't have a whole lot of credibility. But as it relates to me and this story and what I was about to go down this pathway, when I was like the corollary between me and Richard Dreyfuss in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when he was building his Devil's Tower, and then only to find out later on that he wasn't the only one, that there was like a whole community that figured it out and they were drawn to Devil's Tower, and that was the whole point of Close Encounters, right? In my case, so I was a successful entrepreneur in the film and television business. I moved back to Utah in 1999 to take a break, quite frankly, because I was literally living 24/7, swimming with sharks, and it just took a toll on my mindscape because it was too much. I mean, it was insane working conditions. And so I checked out for a short time and I moved to Park City. And because I happen to have all of this experience working in the entertainment industry, I just happened to be in my parents' condo at the time, which I thought was just going to take a little reprieve, but it happened to be across the street from Park City Television. One thing leads to another. I walk over there, I introduce myself to the station manager, and I get this opportunity to become a producer. And shortly thereafter, I'm doing pretty much everything at Park City Television, both on camera, calling football games, but then I tap into the Sundance Film Festival. And through the Sundance Film Festival, suddenly I'm like becoming a big fish in a small pond, contrary to my experience in LA being the small fish in a big pond. And, and I'm going through all of these different processes, all of these different experiences. Every single time, every single step of the way, you're learning more and more about how things operate, about how businesses run, about how things function. And you start to see patterns, right? And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out how to be successful in whatever sort of profession you happen to find yourself in. There's always a methodology about how things work in any particular, place in society. And so I ended up, meeting my what would then become my wife, and we have a son. And it is now about 2000. Let me think about this. I think it was 2004. 2005. And of course, once you get married, the wife is like, hey, look, everybody's getting houses. All of our friends are getting rich off of houses at the time. And I'm like, hey, I don't think I'm ready to own a house, quite frankly, because I didn't think, typically my understanding of the way you purchase houses came from my parents, which were, I think my parents literally put down a down payment for their first house at like 20%. They bought it and they just paid cash for houses since. My parents never took out a mortgage on a house. They always paid cash. So I always thought that the only way you get into it is when you have the income and you can purchase a house, and then, your house increases in value. And then if you decide to move on, that's great. I never thought of real estate myself as a profession to speculate and earn a lot of money like a lot of folks in Utah, of course, do. But at that time period, we got into a pretty nice house. And it was weird to me when I got into the loan to begin with. I remember the friend of mine who was a loan broker at the time, I didn't know all of the elements. So, for example, I thought I was borrowing from a bank. The loan papers that I was signing was from Chase. I figured I'm taking out a loan from Chase. The broker was a friend of mine. I thought he kind of worked for Chase, even though he was working for Intermountain Mortgage. I thought that they had some sort of like corollary deal, but I wasn't asking questions because my wife was actually pregnant. That's what, got us into the first house. And the idea was, okay, you know what? She wants to nest. I can afford it. The way it all worked was I could afford the monthly payment, right? I was just thinking and looking at all the people around me, and the way I was interpreting it at that time was, you buy a house, it goes up in specific value, you sell it, you use that amount of money to get into the next house, and so on and so forth. Though I thought that the first and only house I was going to really mortgage was my first house. That was my perception. So I dive in, and I remember I kind of fancied myself somebody who took transactions seriously. Because like I said, I came from Hollywood, right? And so I had seen and been around some huge movies, and I was able to shuttle like contracts between executive producers and directors and A-list actors, and I happened to be privy, and I really took a lot of time to read these contracts and understand with all the caveats and the premises and this and that. And I'd always heard stories about Hollywood accounting, and I was always really intrigued with what that meant. And so people throughout the years were trying to teach me what they knew about Hollywood accounting, and I learned quickly that most of them had no idea what they were talking about. But all of these things were in the back of my mind, Erica, when I got into my first house. And so I read the contract, and I'm like, okay, I think I know what I'm doing here. But at the same time, I had no freaking clue what this contract said. And I had my wife saying, we got to do it. We got to do it. She was so excited. And you know how that goes when you're married and you got a kid on the way and you have an opportunity at something so exciting. And I had great income at the time. And I figured, I'm going to do this. So I dove in with everything I had, right? I was a little nervous. I didn't know if I'd have income in like 3 to 5 years. I didn't know what the future held. But at the same time, the one question mark I had at that time, Erica, was I kept looking around and I kept thinking to myself, okay, wait a second. Over the course of the last 15 to 20 years, I have seen the income society that you and I both knew as kids, right? So we had manufacturing in the Midwest. We had steel production in the Northeast, particularly in places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and so forth. And, you know, there was manufacturing and there was textiles, and there was this notion that people had incomes, right? So I'm like, okay, well, you get into the house that you can afford. And yet over the course of the previous 15 years, I had seen progressively that income society seemed to evaporate. It was going elsewhere. You know, the production, our car manufacturing was going overseas or to Mexico or whatever. I mean, it might have been an American company, but Ford Motor Company was producing, you know, cars in Mexico. It was during NAFTA and all of these other things. And so none of this stuff really made sense to me, but yet I was getting credit cards up the wazoo. You know, I didn't have a great deal of experience with any finance, and yet suddenly someone's waving a, you know, $375,000 loan in my face that I could just sign on the dotted line and everything's great. And so I took the bait. I was the perfect mark. Everything I was, college educated, I thought I was the guy. I thought I was upwardly mobile. I thought that, you know, I had the nest egg. You know, I thought this is what American society, quite frankly, gave everybody. Holy shnikes, was I naive. I had no idea what was coming. And then suddenly, on September 15th, 2008, everything came to an abrupt end. It's like you could hear that proverbial scratch on the record. And suddenly I went over a cliff. Why? Because income evaporated. The economy hit the skids. I was struggling like you wouldn't believe, but the bills were worse than they ever were before. And I was in a jam like I'd never been. The next thing I know, my world is coming to an end. I remember going up top of Little Cottonwood Canyon, sitting on top of this cliff up around Seven Sisters, looking at the world and going, I'm ready to frickin' send it because this doesn't make sense and I'm failing. And I did not want to live with failure. And it was so, the pain, the agony, the internal sort of meltdown from that experience sent me to the edge. And I just remember sitting there at the top going, wait a second, this doesn't make sense. And that's when I had that moment, like Richard Dreyfuss in the kitchen building Devil's Tower. I was like, there's something not right here. I'm going to figure it out. And lo and behold, I did.
Well, I mean, and the whole thing was, I mean, this was a long, long process for you. And I mean, this took you places that you never would have imagined you would have gone. And I think most people, you know, I mean, something traumatic happens and then they are, you know, you try to get through it and you move on and you don't dig deep for answers. And I think if more of us actually did that, as painstaking as it is, the better off we would be right now with things.
Why have we lost that ability?
We're lazy. You know, and I think there have always been people that, I mean, it's much easier to go to, you know, wake up in the morning, go to work, come home, feed the family, have a cocktail, go to bed. It's much easier to do that than to actually get involved or be, a community activist or, try to do something to change the world. I mean, that's never an easy path. And so, so
You're not kidding.
some days I'd like to just do the, 9 to 5 thing, have a cocktail, go to bed, but I guess it's just not in my DNA, and obviously not in yours either.
Well, for me, like I said before, though, I'd always ask questions. So I was always aware of things growing up. I understood politics. I understood power. I understood mechanisms. I understood history, right? So one of the great fascinations for me was World War II. I think I studied the rise and fall of Hitler in every dimension, in every way, in every possibility that you could possibly imagine when I was in my 20s. And so by the time I was, into my profession, I wasn't naive. I wasn't naive how things happen. I wasn't naive about how people could become, conformists and complicity in something incredibly subhuman, right? And so I've always been on the lookout for that kind of stuff. And so when this stuff happened to me, Erica, I just started asking questions. And those questions led me on the ultimate Wizard of Oz journey. I mean, I was freaking dancing down the yellow brick road. And, we made a series called The Con. And it started opening up doors that in a million years, I can't believe I was able to aggregate. Because it's like once you start searching, you become obsessed. And once you become obsessed, you start finding what you're looking for. And it's amazing how things manifest.
I mean, it really is. And I'm the same way about, I think, everything in my life that I fall in love with. I've become very obsessive, whether it's painting, my music, UFOs. I mean, it's just, I go down that path and I don't let it, I bite onto it and I don't let it go. And it's been a good thing in a lot of ways. And it can be a destructive thing if you're not careful about how far you let it, kind of bleed into your life, because other people around you don't necessarily understand where you're coming from.
Oh, well, let me chime in on that. I've lost so many friends who just don't have the capacity or the bandwidth, or quite frankly, the what's the word I'm looking for? Empathy. If it's not happening to them, a lot of times they don't care. That's what's insane. And that's why I think we're in this jam up that we're in, right? I think because the more that people ignore what's happening around them, the more they make it inevitable that's going to happen to everybody else.
Like the whole thing. Yeah. I mean, I saw that when, I got involved with some things with the school board, the Salt Lake City School Board, that made quite the waves. And it was, there were things that were so corrupt and so wrong. And these were affecting little children and affecting people that have worked their whole lives, that were making a meager living, but they loved our children. And I remember, getting in there and finding out how much corruption there really was. And I couldn't stop because nobody else, you had some parents that were looking into it, but they got to a point and they said, no, can't do it anymore. And that made me sad and it made me angry. And I just thought, God, this isn't comfortable, but get off your asses and do something and try to make the world a better place.
Yeah, I know that you are also, I love your company name, the Pilates. What do you say?
Total Body Pilates.
Yeah, I love on your voicemail. Total Body Pilates. I mean, it just has it has this great ring to it. But I've always been an athlete, and trust me, I've done my fair share of partying. But I always know when my body's in alignment, right? I always know when I'm out of whack too, right? So like if I've been drinking too much, or if I've been doing too much like bad eating, or whatever the case may be, throughout the years, I found always the discipline to get back into my center, right? And so when your body's aligned and your actions are aligned with your principles, you can't become corrupted. It's so weird how, to me, how what I think is the embodiment of corruption is cowardice. Complicity and cowardice is what enables corruption. What's a trip, though, is what's at the apex of that corruption. There's always a strong man or a strong woman, I'm sure, or strong this or that in some capacity, But it's just mind-boggling to me that people are so cowardly that fall in line to serve corruption. And it happens throughout history.
It does. And I think the thing that's been so fascinating to me with the UFO community is we all get into this because we think we're breaking ground and we are, cool enough to have these thoughts that are outside the box. But yet, most of us have gone down the rabbit hole where we're falling in and we don't know we're being manipulated by some of these power brokers that do not have our best interests at heart. And so just by not being smart enough to make those connections, we lose our personal power and we become more manipulated than the normal person. And that's crazy.
Explain to you how that works in our society. What you just described was the great financial crisis and how it led to today. Okay, so everybody wants a college education or a house or a car or whatever goods and services that this incredible world of technology provides us, right? And but that's a little hard to do sometimes if you don't have a consistent income. So what I was referring to earlier is that, we've created this society when we got rid of the income society and we farmed out manufacturing and all these other things. There was a level of high paying jobs that were basically, upwardly mobile, white working class jobs that later incorporated people of all races and colors, never as great as it could have. But the bottom line is there was opportunity for a while. And a lot of this stuff manifested after World War II, specifically when we were the last country standing and we were basically the production apparatus for the world because everything had been destroyed, right? So we were building the cars, we're building the ships, we're building the aircraft, we're building everything that got, basically distributed out the world. And, the jobs were good and the upward mobility was good and the growing upwardly mobile middle class and all of these things that led to consumption that particularly was the American dream. You put it all together and it's the American dream. And it goes up in value because, well, people have jobs, they increase money, they live in the same house, they have their families, they live there for 20 years, that, house rises in value. It all had equilibrium. It all made sense. Then suddenly in the late 70s, we're farming out our jobs overseas. America becomes more and more of a financial middleman. And in the end, what we ended up creating was financialization. And financialization killed the golden goose. The golden goose, of course, being manufacturing and everything that we produce. And so it created a mythical economy. It replaced credit for the income society. Now manifest that into the housing market, right? So suddenly everybody's getting a loan, right? In the quite frankly, it goes back to the late 90s more so. I think it's kind of the beginning part of this whole thing. But by the time you get to 2004, 2005, 6, 7, the housing industry was the economy, and it was all predicated on loans, and everybody was getting a loan. And quite frankly, a lot of people, in fact, a vast majority of people that ultimately got into these loans were people who already owned their houses. They had equity in their houses, and they ultimately had no more income, but yet they had other bills. They wanted the kids to go to college. They had to fix the roof. They had to do X, Y, and Z. They wanted the ATV. They wanted the boat, blah, blah, blah. Suddenly everybody was offering these loans because they said your house is worth so much more than it used to be. And everybody's like, ka-ching, let's use our house as a bank, i.e. an ATM. So people who weren't sophisticated in reading contracts, like I had prefaced earlier, get into new loans. Suddenly, they don't realize that depending on the loan that they had actually purchased, they were set up to suddenly have adjustable arms, and their payment was going through the roof 2 years downstream. And suddenly their broker's calling them back going, hey, you can either try to pay this loan that you can't afford, or I can refinance you. And suddenly they're refinancing. And this is going on and on all over the country, millions of times a day, blah, blah, blah. Now, how is that different than what we used to have? Well, what we used to have were banks that made loans to clients that they could actually do what is known as underwriting. They would determine what kind of job you had, what kind of payment you could afford, what kind of loan you could possibly afford. And those banks would hold on to those loans for the life of those loans. So they only had X amount of dollars that they could loan out per year based on performance. And the underwriting was absolutely imperative because those banks' soundness and success were dependent on underwriting. You don't want to loan to somebody that can't afford to pay the loan back. Obviously, everybody knows that, right? Would you say that's obvious, Erica? You don't want to loan somebody. Oh, okay. So would it surprise you then that suddenly, in about the arena of, let's call it 2004-ish, that now people were making loans to anybody with a pulse. In fact, a guy that, and I think you watched our series.
Yes,
one of
wonderful.
Thank you. One of our whistleblowers said, if you could fog a mirror, we could give you a loan. And what that meant was something had fundamentally changed. Well, what had changed? What had changed is that it was no longer banks giving you a loan that they sat on for 30 years. It was usually a whole consortium of what we call mortgage brokers that were involved with lenders, that had vertical enterprises with colleagues that were appraisers, underwriters, and they were all moving volume of loans through what we call the securitization pipeline. The securitization pipeline would basically put thousands and thousands and thousands of loans into what we call tranches. Those tranches were packaged. They were sent through Wall Street to the world, to institutional investors, pension funds. So, for example, teachers' pension funds, police pension funds, Navy pension funds, you name it, right? So ultimately, it was a black box casino. And what would happen is the people that were making the loans were lying, stealing, and cheating to their clients to get people into loans as quickly as they could, using absolute fraudulent practices, which were all, quite frankly, criminal practices at each level. So if you underwrite a loan and you know that that person can't afford a loan, that's one set of rules that they broke that are felonies. Same with you do a fake appraisal. But each and every one of these people in the pipeline were incentivized by the chain to get as many loans as possible, as quickly as possible, into the securitization process to basically push this thing out so that Wall Street, who was also providing what we call the warehouse loans, they were the money, they were the crack that was feeding the crack to the kids on the playground. They were feeding all these loans to everybody else around. They didn't give a crap what the underwriting standards were. They just needed those loans. And they kept building it and building it and building it. And then that's the next part of the story. So I'll stop and let you ask questions.
No, I mean, it's so fascinating. And I have to say that I'm just engrossed with this wonderful docuseries that you've done, because you've done a good job explaining your story, but then also, Addie Polk, I mean, some of the other people that lost their pensions. I mean, just the humanity, the devastating toll that all of this is taken on so many people, including both of us, including probably most of my listeners. And we're all going through similar things today. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. And then I want to tie this into some things that I've learned about Robert Bigelow and some of his business practices. And again, back to the UFO community, which we will do. We're going to take a 3-minute break. And we will be back, and I want to just say thank you, Patrick, for being here. Patrick is a producer, writer, known for Dark Matter, Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, and The Con, and you need to watch that. It is exceptional. I have posted links on my website as well as on my social media, so check it out. We are going to take a 3-minute break, and we will be back. And thanks again to everybody in chat. Make sure you go to Spreaker at the top of it, follow my show, and if you are so kind, please donate to help keep me on the air. I appreciate it. You can go to UFOclassified.com, and we will be right back after the break. Welcome back to UFO Classified, my friends. I am Erica Lukes, happy to be here every Friday with a group of people that I truly enjoy hanging out with. I love getting into chat, even if we have differing political opinions, which clearly we might tonight, but we always are respectful and can talk through things, and we have a place where we can share ideas, and that's a really cool thing. I want to thank all of the people that help keep the show on the air. You mean the world to me, and there are a lot of production expenses to doing this, and I'm getting the hang of my audio and all of this stuff, but I appreciate it because I am never going to stop doing this. This subject is so fascinating and so important, and there's so many layers to it that I am hooked. And I promise you one thing, I will continue to do my work with archiving and preserving material that is historical. You all know that recently I traveled to California to retrieve the Androffa files, 70 boxes of files, and these are personal correspondence with the oldest UFO organizations, people involved, Jacques Vallée, you name it, information about Steven Spielberg. In fact, we were talking about Steven Spielberg earlier in the show, and I found some interesting pictures of him attending a UFO meeting in California. So lots of good connections I'll be making, and thank you for your continued love and support. I am here tonight with Patrick Lovell, who has been a friend of mine. In fact, my favorite dance picture is the picture of you, me, Keith, and Christine. I just have to say that.
Man, we look good.
I know we honestly did look really good in that picture.
That was so 16 Candles, wasn't it?
Yep.
Yeah, totally.
That was so much fun. And you mentioned in the first half you were talking about you skateboarding and listening to ska, and that just brings back so many memories of such a fun time. I imagine that you would have a Vespa. That just kind of goes with your whole persona, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Like I said, I was a trench coat kind of guy.
Do you remember Sean Fightmaster?
Yes, I do. I remember seeing a bunch of videos of him on YouTube. Or where was that recently? In fact, did you date him?
I did. And this, for people out there going, what in the crap are you talking about? Sean Fightmaster I met him in 7th grade, and he was he was a punk. I mean, he had the mohawk and he wore, a kilt, and I mean, just out at every punk show. And there was a movie that they made, Salt Lake City Punk.
SLC Punk, yeah.
Yeah. And it was quite a great movie. And one of the characters was loosely based on Sean, and Sean was a really lovely, kind human being, and unfortunately he fell into the heroin and had just a very sad demise. But yeah, I did date him. I still have little love letters from him in 7th grade.
I thought that was so interesting that you did. I remember him from back in the day, and yeah, so I was a part of that whole scene also, right? But I didn't do what he did, but I remember hearing stories about him and some other cats actually, now that I think about it, another friend of mine dated him. I remember he hitchhiked to Vegas in a crazy frame of mind. I heard a story about that. And I thought to myself, oh my God, like he just walked down the freaking freeway to Vegas.
I can see that. I mean, and he was just such a, his whole story was so tragic, but I mean, I will never forget him, and he had a kind heart and just one of those beautiful souls that went down the wrong path and things like that. But that's funny. So you guys will have to check out SLC Punk. Definitely.
Yes, it was a great film.
Yeah, it was. And so thanks for letting me go off on that little tangent. But you released back in August a 5-part docuseries called The Con. And in this is a really important series to me because it talks so much about things that all of us have gone through, and it talks about the 2008, the financial crisis that really affected all of us. And I think we're in a similar time today, but you were just going into a little bit about that, and I would like you to continue if you don't mind.
Well, I mean, you asked at the top of the show, to kind of consider what's happening, with the siege of the Capitol by Trump supporters, and whatever variables that might be included in there, and you asked me what the relevance might be to my journey, and it's just incredible because what's happening now is a result of what didn't happen then. So, for example, there's this incredible wave of Twitter blowups today where people all over the place are like, no one went to jail for the crimes of 2008 that can't happen again. And I guess the reference must be, and people can interpret it any way they want depending on what their ideological bent is. But I guess what they're inferring is somebody's going to jail for what happened yesterday, and hopefully a lot of people, right? So ultimately, how does that relate to the great 2008 financial crisis? Well, ultimately, the con, I mean, I appreciate you saying it's important. To me, it's everything. And I think anybody who went through it will recognize that it is everything, especially if they had their house stolen, which was actually the point. Everybody got set up, whether they know it or not. And it led to such a cataclysm of what this country is all about on so many levels. The first being that literally millions of people went through this process. I think the numbers are somewhere along the lines of 10 million filed foreclosures. I saw numbers as high as 16 million filed foreclosures as early as 2012. And, you just do the math on that. That's over 50 million Americans. And then you include the pensions and the global crunch and everything else. We're talking hundreds of millions of people that got swept up in this madness, and many people never recovered. And nobody understands how it worked. Why? Because we trust institutions. We trust the government, to your point about ufology and some of these other, go down the corridor and the rabbit hole and blah, blah, blah. And you got to be very careful. But you can't, we're talking about conspiracy theories earlier, and we're talking about the difference between, well, we didn't talk about the difference, but I'll paint the picture of the difference. So there's conspiracy theories and there's conspiracies. People do things. And let me tell you something. Power is extremely clever. So if you've got a ton of money and you've got incredibly bright professionals, particularly in the legal field, working for you, and you're a financial institution, you have specific incentives, do you think you might be able to deceive people, my friend?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the thing that like I said, and I keep throwing this back in there, the more I see about what, who are the big players in the UFO world and what they've been doing behind the scenes. And I just sit there and go, oh my God, this is bad. People have to know about this.
Well, let me take you down the path in terms of the methodology as it works in finance, which is probably just as mysterious to people as UFOs. Trust me, but there's a method to the madness. Okay, so ultimately, because of my journey, I was very, very, very fortunate to come into the sphere of a gentleman by the name of William K. Black, and William K. Black is the foremost criminologist in the United States. He was what they call general counsel back at the savings and loan debacle, which took place in the late 80s, early 90s. And the savings and loan debacle was what we call Act 1 to what took place in 2008. And we're right in the middle of Act 4, by the way. So Act 1 is this massive, massive financial deception, and it stems from what's known as control fraud. So think about this in terms of what you just said, in terms of Bigelow and some of these other people that might be, extremely well-resourced because they've got a lot of money, a lot of connections, a lot of power, and so on and so forth. And especially for a lot of folks out there that are just naturally inclined and predisposed towards conspiracy theories because they've lived long enough to know that they're paranoid because they don't trust power. And if you may recall, I think I said at the outset of our show here that I just was naturally inclined to not trust power because I'm an American. I mean, that's our tradition. We overthrew King George III and, of course, the East India Trading Company and the Redcoats because of unfair taxation without representation and everything that supposedly, manifested the American Revolution in all its dimensions that led to, of course, the separation of powers. That's the whole idea of the Constitution, that no man is above the law, that you can't enable conspiracies to function because they do. So if you've got monarchies or if you've got any sort of ism, like we talked about at the top of the show, it doesn't matter if it's Stalinism or Hitlerism or whatever ism, you have a baked-in system of power, right? So how does power operate? Well, you conspire. You conspire for outcomes based on whatever those particular objectives may be. But in the United States, the idea is separation of powers because you have the judicial branch, you have the legislative branch, and you have the executive branch. And each one is supposed to operate independently and be a check on each other's power. But this is what the con reveals. And this is why everybody is up in arms. Everybody's chaotic. Everybody's all over the map. Everybody's at each other's throats. That's because power figured out how to get us to go at each other instead of them. We all got played. So for years and years and decades, we got rid of the golden goose. We got rid of the manufacturing society that had stabilization factors, that created equilibrium, that people had a chance to like have a roof over their head and income to be able to support a family and so on and so forth. And we replaced that with financialization, which was credit. You get people involved in credit and debt. That's the same debt that's existed throughout history. Doesn't matter if we're talking about Babylonia, if we're talking about the time of Christ, if we're talking about the Middle Ages, if we're talking about Europe and monarchies. There is a thing called debt suffrage, right? So most of the time, like in Western monarchies, that you'd have serfdom, and you had people that worked on the land. They got into debt. Basically, they were able to live on the land of the king, but they had to produce, and whatever debt they got into for whatever sort of resources that they had to be able to manufacture whatever crops that they were doing, they were in debt to the crown, and then that they had to serve it up to the crown, which they were taxed. But the thing that they also had to give was that their basically loyalty to the crown, especially if there was going to be war. That's how that worked out. Well, in the American Revolution, we broke away from that. We create separation of powers. And then by the time we get to the Roaring '20s, we ended up with this stuff called, there's a lot of Ponzi schemes. Have you ever heard of the terminology Ponzi scheme, Erica?
In fact, I think MUFON might have a little something to do with that. Yep.
Well, quite frankly, it does have a lot of the same similarities. I mean, a lot of religions are like this. Scientology, a lot of people might say the Mormons are like this. A lot of people say that about a lot of religions, quite frankly, right? There's a kind of a central hierarchy, patriarchal sort of thing, and people give money and it kind of goes upward. And, but with Ponzi schemes in the nature of what was taking place during the Roaring '20s, for example, is we had all of this technological increases, right? And so they had to get credit to people that wanted to buy products for the houses. So like we had new technology for stoves and things that were in the house and cars and things, and so we created this. There was an income society, but at the same time, people wanted more and more money for goods. And so they created this credit sort of marketplace, and Wall Street started to sell securities and all sorts of different businesses. And they created basically sawdust securities. So, for example, you ever hear the old cliche, you want to buy some swampland in Florida?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so that's where that comes from. This stuff is valueless, but because of appraisal fraud, it creates a lot of money and it becomes a Ponzi scheme, and it's always the last man standing that gets, caught holding the bag, and then the whole thing collapses. I mean, bubbles have happened throughout history. There's a bubble in Amsterdam known as the Great Tulip Bubble. I think it happened in like 1400s. People get into what's known as like irrational exuberance. If they can put $10 in a pie and make $100 quickly, they're going to keep doing it, right? But eventually, if it's a Ponzi scheme and it's not built on the fundamentals, it's going to collapse. And so that's what happened after the Roaring '20s, and that led to the Great Depression. And when we had the Great Depression, there was a global run. That's what created Germany and Nazi Germany. There was so much suffering because nobody had any money anymore. There was hyperinflation in Germany. That's a whole other story. There was, 25% unemployment in the United States, and people suffered. And they were, when people suffer and they don't have jobs and they can't provide and they're living in tents and they're like homeless and all of these other things that take place, bad things are going to happen, right? Well, three things took place as a result of the global depression that was all predicated on a scam. And it's a complete criminal activity, these Ponzi schemes, because it's deception. And you're not buying into what you think you are, and so you're getting set up to fail. So ultimately, what happened after the Great Depression was Franklin Delano Roosevelt got elected on a huge populist wave that was really farmers and laborers that were like, screw this. We don't want to deal with industrialists out of New York. We don't want to deal with the bankers, the financiers, because they're all full of it. We're going to turn the tables on those guys. We want government to work for us. We've heard of this combination of we the people, a government of, by, and for the people. That must not fail, Lincoln said. The idea is that government works for the people, not government working for corporations to suppress the people, right? That's the whole idea, separation of powers on the whole bit. And so the United States continues to evolve throughout its history, and we get to 1933, and three things happen globally that really affect the next 50 years, as well as ufology, by the way. But do you know what those three huge things I'm inferring at this moment in the conversation are?
No.
Oh, they're three people. The first is Hitler comes out of Germany. Stalin comes out of Russia. So that's fascism and communism. What comes out of the United States?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep, you're right.
A reconfiguration of the law. It's called regulation.
God.
So what happened is, and you hear these numbskulls talking about deregulation. What they are is a bunch of frickin' Ponzi schemers. They don't want somebody up their ass to prevent them from deceiving people. That's the whole point. So what happened in the Great Depression is a gentleman by the name of Ferdinand Pecora was assigned by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Pecora was a Sicilian immigrant, okay? So he came on the boat literally with like the fictional depiction of a guy by the name of Don Corleone. Do you recognize that name?
Yeah. I don't know. Yes.
Don Corleone was the Godfather. That's the fictional Godfather from the films The Godfather. Right. So this guy Pecora, he wasn't an expert in finance, but he was an expert in deception. He was an expert in the mob. And what he did was Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, figure out what Wall Street did. And he did. He got the evidence, and he put all the CEOs of the Wall Street banks at that time on the stand in front of the American people who had just had 25% unemployment and were starving, and they started to get the truth of how they got played and how they got destroyed while Wall Street walked away with millions at that time, right? And they were like, we're going to burn the frickin' house down if you guys don't set things straight. And so government suddenly went back to of, by, and for the people. They created what was known as the Glass-Steagall Act. It separated the mechanics of investment banking from finance, from investment banking. And the way that works is like every engine, whether we're talking about, let's talk about, for example, the big question I have in ufology when I think about what I saw in Sedona that time, which would be what the antimatter machine, because it can move all over the place. Well, there's a way things are engineered, right? There's a way things work. It's the same thing with finance, Erica. This isn't rocket science. This is history. We know how to make good loans. If you make bad loans to make fees in the short run, you're going to destroy the system. But usually the guys there used to be a saying on Wall Street during our time here. They said, I'll be gone, you'll be gone, which meant was sell everything you can as quickly as you can and don't worry about the consequences. Make as much money as you can now, which means rape and pillage as fast as you can. So let's think about this, right? So in the aftermath of the Great Depression, we end up with Ferdinand Pecora creating the facts to the American people that demand resolution. And one thing leads to another. They create Glass-Steagall, and they created the Securities and Exchange Act that made any sales of fraudulent securities a criminal liability, which meant that you could take things down. Now, let me fast forward to the 80s. By the time we get Ronald Reagan comes in after 4 decades of what was the New Deal. And he's like, government is the problem. And the next thing you know, he's selling deregulation. That's when it starts. It actually started in Carter because we got interstate banking. But with Reagan, he wants deregulation. That leads to what we call the 3Ds. And this happens over the course of Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton on overdrive, and then Bush 2 took it to the next level. The 3Ds are deregulation, desupervision, decriminalization. Now, let me ask you this, Erica. You've been around. Have you ever been to a fraternity party?
Well, can I plead the fifth on that? Yes, I probably have.
So what do you think the likelihood is if you have a fraternity party with a bunch of beautiful girls, let's say you have a whole lot of drugs, a whole lot of booze, and a whole lot of dudes with absolutely no rules. What do you think is going to happen?
I would say that somebody is probably going to be raped. Something.
What happens if that rape does not get convicted?
I don't know. You tell me.
Do you think they might do it again?
Oh, yeah, the rapist. Okay, sorry. Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so that's kind of a minuscule. I don't mean minuscule in terms of that's not important, but what I'm saying is that it's a small version of what I'm talking about as a whole. When you get rid of deregulation, you get rid of the laws. Get rid of the stop signs. You get rid of the stoplights. You get rid of the rules that make this thing function the way it's supposed to function. So with deregulation, you got rid of the laws. With desupervision, you didn't look. With decriminalization, you didn't hold anybody accountable. So what happens to people that have a shit ton of power and a lot of money without any accountability?
Not a lot. I mean, yeah, nothing.
What they're gonna do is they're gonna rape everybody.
Right. Absolutely. Which we've seen time and time again. That's
the metaphor. That became our financial system. They got rid of the golden goose. They replaced it with this housing bubble. The housing bubble went like crazy. It blew up. Then suddenly everybody was into this foreclosure mill. Now, there's a whole lot of semantics and not semantics. I mean, it's details by way of what happens with the laws of the land. Here's the worst part of this thing. So we're supposed to be a country of laws where everybody's equal. Erica, are we a country of laws where everybody's equal?
No.
Who has more justice than someone else?
He with the most money.
Okay. And so what might that be called in the grand spectrum of American history when you think back to the American Revolution? Did King George have all the money and all of the law on his side and everything else? Mm-hmm. What do we call that?
See, you just have to, you go, you tell us.
We call that tyranny.
Yes.
Right? So what happened in the wake of the great financial crisis in 2008? Did anybody go to jail?
No.
So let me tell you what happened. Millions upon millions of people lost everything that they had. They got devastated. Wall Street made trillions of dollars on the way up in this whole thing. And then when it exploded, do you think they went bankrupt? They got trillions of dollars. Where did they get trillions of dollars from? That's right, from the federal government. It was backstop. So did they get held accountable for the crimes that they created?
No.
No, they got incentivized. And so what happens ultimately at the end of the day when everybody doesn't have money and all the money goes upward, you get money in fewer and fewer people's hands. Do you have integrity of the law when that happens?
No.
No, of course not. You have chaos. You've got tyranny. You've got what leads to the kind of things that took place on the Capitol the other day. Now, here's the crazy thing about the people that are supportive of making America great again, right? Those types of folks, a lot of them have just as much reason to be upset and just crazed about the way things are at the moment, but they want to blame the Democrats. Do you think they're right?
I think there's a combination of blame that needs to go around on all sides.
Let me tell you, the Democrats, Obama and Holder, were the centrifuge of this whole thing. They let this thing go down, and they blocked for the blanks, and they let the corruption happen in a way that never in a million years what I thought would happen. They are just as guilty as anybody else. Does that make Trump less guilty?
No.
No, Trump was up to his eyeballs in this madness. This is all of Trump's business model. So when Trump is talking about fraud, and I've had this conversation on social media the last couple of days, and it's pretty insane, right? You can imagine. But, you know, Trump's entire business model for decades has been fraud. By the way, is fraud shenanigans?
Mm-hmm.
No, fraud is not shenanigans. Joan Belushi at the end of Animal House taking off with Mandy Pepperidge is shenanigans. No, fraud is criminal theft by deception.
Okay, well, all right. See, I love how you're asking me all these questions and you're making me think.
So let's think of Bigelow. Do you think Bigelow's above board? I don't know all the stuff on Bigelow.
I think Bigelow is about as not above board as probably anybody that I can think of. And I think it's really sad. And so here you've got Bigelow, who's basically a slumlord. He owns the Budget Suites, and he's made a great deal of money off of that. And when you go back and you start looking at some of the lawsuits that have been levied against him, some of the people that have been, because this is, the Budget Suites is low income places where people can stay for shorter periods of time, and there are people that are going there, and they are a few days late on the rent, and they're finding pins in their door. They can't get in to collect their belongings or any of their personal items. And this happened just recently with the pandemic. There was supposed to be a moratorium on doing this kind of thing, and yet apparently Bigelow and crew were up to getting people evicted from their homes, and that's just the tip of the iceberg.
He's tied into this stuff.
Oh yeah,
that's hilarious.
Yeah,
okay, that doesn't surprise me. That doesn't surprise me. But there you go. So let me just kind of finish this track real quick, and then we'll circle it back. So the con is the largest conspiracy of lies and cover up in history. It's not conspiracy theory. It's conspiracy, because it was all predicated on what we call control fraud. Control fraud comes from the top down. It comes from guys like Bigelow. It comes from CEOs. CEOs have perverse incentives in their structures where they can create plausible deniability because they've got whole network of legal staff around them, and they can create LLCs, and they can create deception and different sorts of holding companies, other things that manufacture certain things that it's like smoke and mirrors the whole time, right? So in the case of the financial crisis, all of these CEOs, guys at Jamie Dimon at Chase, Lloyd Blankfein at Goldman Sachs, Brian Moynihan at Bank of America, and so on and so forth. These are the heavy hitters in finance. They literally own the country, and I'll tell you why. Because they're above the law, okay? So every aspect of what took place in the great financial crisis was criminal, based on statutes that are felonies. There were lies and deception every step of the way. So we're talking millions upon millions of lies, whether it was at the point of origination when people created documentation fraud to get people stuffed into loans that they couldn't afford, which were predicated on what we call unfair acts of deception or practices of deception, which are laws on all 50 books, which are felonies as well, based on truth in lending. But here's the whole thing. Did anybody not see this coming? Was it a giant surprise like everybody pretended like it was in 2008? No, everybody knew it was coming. Are you kidding me? Alan Greenspan, who was the CEO, or not CEO, he was the head of the Federal Reserve, was a guy who believed in what they call libertarianism, but based on Ayn Randism, which is let the market happen the way the market happens, right? So what happens when you don't have any laws?
I would say we're seeing that right at the moment in a little bit,
You have criminality, and so who does justice serve? It serves the money, right? We've already established.
Right.
So who has the money? Well, let me tell you who has the money. The people that basically train wrecked everybody else, and then they got trillions of dollars on the upswing based on free money from the Federal Reserve that can actually print money with digits. How much money did it cost to stabilize the global economy based on the 2008 great financial crisis? Do you know?
No.
Okay, so the first thing that people think of that are in the know, they talk about TARP, which is the Troubled Assets Relief Program. That was $750 billion. Does that sound like a lot of money?
Yep, look, fair pocket change, perhaps.
It was a drop in the bucket because it ultimately was $29 trillion that basically backstopped the 2008 great financial crisis. How many billions constitute a trillion?
That's a good. You tell me. You keep going because I'm
1,000 billion. How many millions are in a billion?
Keep going.
It's 1,000 million, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're talking about 29 trillion. I mean, that's 290,000 million, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the amount of money that we're talking about is so extraordinary. Let me put it into perspective. How much do you think NASA's budget is?
I don't know.
I think let me think about this for a second. I know that the CIA is 15 billion. I think that NASA is like 22 billion a year. This was 29 trillion. Do you think we could find some aliens with 29 trillion?
You would think there might be a little bit more than what we've seen put out there to the public. Yeah, I would think.
So where did you think the money went? Did it go to people that got devastated in this whole thing and they got set up?
Yep.
No, it didn't. It went to the people that blew everybody up.
Okay, I just have to say it's so funny. I'm just not to interrupt you, but I've got a couple people in chat. And they're like, you're like should be a quiz show host.
Thank you. Well, I'm trying to teach you guys the truth of what's
I know.
going on. Everybody's got to wake up to this thing, and it's not woke in like the silly spiritual sense of like you think you got it. No, man. The law is the law. There are way things work, and there are way things don't work. And there's policy that predicates how we get law, and then there's people who are supposed to actually uphold the law. And what I can tell you without going into all the quiz show semantics and the details of everything is the long and the short of it is our country has failed miserably. Institutions have failed. The judicial department has failed. The Department of Justice. The judiciary has failed. Did they uphold the laws of millions of people that got train wrecked into bulldozed into foreclosures and everything else? No, they got freaking whitewashed because was that legal? No. The legal profession is so freaking deceptive, it would make the ufology arena that you're talking about's head spin. The shit that's going on right now, pardon my language, is so beyond comprehension. It's the way I describe it is it's a corporate fascist or a corporate communist system undergirded by a criminal syndicate. Mm-hmm. It's theft. That's right. It's theft. It's stealing. That's it. They stole millions of people's homes because they set them up. 90% of the people that lost their homes in these transactions owned their homes before they got refinanced, and they didn't understand what they were getting at. And most people think that it's caveat emptor, meaning buyer beware. You could have a PhD from the top Ivy League education in criminal defense and still not understand what were in those contracts. That's how set up for deceived they were, and the courts let it happen. It's insanity. So now we'll take it full circle to yesterday or 2 days ago. People stormed the Capitol. Regardless of what we think about the people that stormed the Capitol, I'm not big fans, and I'm certainly not big fans of the Capitol Police that stepped aside and let MAGA guys go in there into the people's house. But was I intrigued that a populist movement sent a message to the corruption in Congress that you're on notice? I just wish a lot of people who had lost their homes did the same thing years ago, maybe peacefully, maybe in a way that had millions of people on the Washington Mall that said the jig's up, we know who did what, when, and how, and how you covered it up, and now we're going to hold you accountable. But if you don't have the law, you end up with a couple of things. You end up with civil war or massive, massive war of one form or another. That's just how it goes. That's history. And I'll give you one last thing to consider here as I kind of finish up this thought process. So we all know that absolute power corrupts absolutely. There was a libertarian philosopher in 17th century France, right before the French Revolution, where they pulled out the guillotines and they chopped everybody's heads off of the aristocracy. And this guy's name was Bastiat. And Bastiat said, when a group of men discover plunder for power, they create a legal system that authorizes it, and a moral code to glorify it. That's history, Erica. That's history until we had life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and justice for all. Is that what we've got right now? Mm-hmm. No, we live in a frickin' failed state. And so, we're on the verge of absolute civil war or whatever comes next unless people get hip to the game and demand accountability from the corruption. Because right now the corruption has got everybody fighting each other.
And then that's exactly it. And that is what is so sad. And it's, like I said, I mean, there's corruption on both sides. And I mean, but I think that, I just hope that we wake up and realize that, like we mentioned at the beginning of the show, that there are corporate entities and players that know how to, by analyzing data, they know how to play on our fears, our beliefs, our dreams, and all of these things. And they are doing that strategically right now to create this kind of chaos. And so we've got to freaking rein it in. And we've got to start, we've got to freaking stay off social media, for God's sakes. We've got to start looking at looking behind the scenes and the players involved and why they're doing what they're doing. because this is deep, and this is going to really hurt a lot of us.
It could lead to the death of millions. I mean,
Right.
It's already led to the disaster of millions. I mean, it blows my mind, that we've lost 350,000 people, and barely people bat an eye on this whole thing, through the COVID thing. And I know there's a lot of disbelievers out there. Please don't come near me without a mask. But the long and the short of it is, the people are nuts. I think what happened is that they've got so much information that they can't see the forest through the trees. And it takes discipline. It takes time. It also takes, obviously, the ability to have capacity. I mean, that takes me back to my reality in Sedona, right? I know what I saw. Now, do I know it this many years later, after all of the considerations, that what I saw wasn't man-made based on UFO technology? I don't know that at this stage of the game. But I know what I saw wasn't within the confines of the technology that I'm aware of, that we're all aware of, because it's not the aeronautical sort of stuff that we've all come to appreciate by, modern air travel, right? What I saw was something that was, like Area 51 stuff.
And it's so crazy how all of this kind of goes full circle. And I want to go back to people like Bigelow for a minute, because, as you know, this has been something that's been important to me, because I've started to peel back layers with that. And I mean, even 3 years ago, I was thinking that this guy was a visionary, that he was sitting there and going to give us answers to all of these things. And yet, if you really look back, he's given us answers to nothing, but he's made a lot of money. And, as I've started to peel back the skinwalker deception.
Wait a second. What has he made a lot of money on? That's what
on real estate.
Oh, well, there you have it.
Right.
So, dude, that makes me laugh thinking about it. He's one of those guys. Yeah, that's what I just spent the last hour telling you about.
Yeah. Kind of comical, isn't it?
Their entire model is deception.
Well, and it's fascinating because, like I said, I've been doing this, this whole little bit of research behind the scenes, and I want to just read this because this reminds me of kind of some of what you were talking about with the crisis in 2008. And this is just a little bit that said, ads will notify eligible tenants for settlement. This was from Bill Gang back in March 1999, and I'm reading just a paragraph of this. Barbara Buckley, who heads Nevada Legal Services, alleged in a lawsuit that tenants behind on the rent were pinned or illegally locked out of some of Bigelow's 1,200 apartment units. The settlement came after Buckley learned that evidence of pinning included an actual list of tenants who'd been locked out of instead of being served with a 5-day eviction notice as required by law had been destroyed. Bigelow and his wife Diane own the Blue Harbor, South Cove, Harbor Island, and Shelter Island apartment complexes, but they didn't admit any wrongdoing in the settlement. They stated in a news release that the negotiated end to the hard-fought lawsuit was a business decision. So there is, again, time and time where people are saying that somebody like Bigelow is basically a slumlord and evicting people who have no place to go. And that's happening during the pandemic, allegedly, by what I have found and have been reading. And there was also, if you go to justiaus.law, Nevada Supreme Court cases, there was evidence that people were fired. A specific person was fired for wanting to stand up to somebody for they were being discriminated against because they were black. There was also another woman who I guess had worked for Bigelow, and she was terminated, and then she had a person that worked for Bigelow, 2 people that worked for Bigelow, come in, enter her apartment, and hit her in the stomach and assault her with a handgun. And so, again, you can read all of these things on justiaus.law, but you start painting the picture of somebody who is capable of this type of behavior and really not thinking about not having a heart or a soul. And
to me, I think it's really funny that you brought this up, because I had no idea about any of this, and I can't comment on having, a real fundamental understanding. But the way painting the picture of this guy is he just sounds like, A, he'd be a good friend of Trump's and Jared Kushner, because that's their business model, which is a bunch of BS to begin with. But that really has a lot of pain and suffering for real people, right? And but if that's the guy who becomes in the sort of crow's nest of whatever sort of introspection on Skinwalker and all the rest, you got to think to yourself, who is this clown? What is he up to?
Right.
And I happened to see. I was watching. Where did I see it on? Was it the History Channel, or was it? I guess it was Skinwalker Ranch, right? And the first thing that I thought of when I first saw the first episode, and I didn't see the entire series, although I kind of like the science guy. I can't remember his. No, not Bill Guy.
The science guy, Travis Taylor. Okay.
Yeah, I kind of liked him, but in terms of Bigelow, I remember seeing that first. Like he was like, kind of had this vibe like James Bond in this like super high end office and the helicopter and all the rest. And I was like, I don't know if your listeners know this, but there is a ton of fraud in Utah. In fact, Utah is one of the leading states for what we call industrial banking. And there's a ton of money here that is from money laundering from all over the world that there's just no regulation here, going back to my point. And so Bigelow is probably one of those guys. I have no knowledge of that, but I wouldn't be surprised. And, and by the way, I don't know if do you remember the movie Fletch? Did you ever see the movie Fletch?
Yeah, with Chevy Chase, yep.
Right. So I don't know if you remember this, but Fletch was this journalist, this cool LA Lakers fan who was a journalist, and he was this like super sleuth guy that could figure out the stuff. And he went on, would he go to the country club and he said, put it on the Underhills tab? That kind of stuff always cracked me up, man. But Chevy Chase's character pulls the thread, and all of that stuff, the understory of that script, the fictional depiction, was based on the savings and loan crisis. And it had a major connection to Provo. Now, interestingly enough, it had a major connection between Provo and Orange County, which are two huge hotspots for fraud, especially real estate fraud. And I would not be at all surprised that your friend Bigelow might be involved with that. So where does that leave you in terms of what his involvement is with the UFO community? What would be, so he's made a lot of money on a lot of different things with relation to Skinwalker? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I mean, I think he did make a fair amount with Skinwalker, and I also think that he was probably given, although I need to find out more information, get the documentation, which could be exciting to come by, but I mean, probably paid by contractors to go in and do all sorts of testing at Skinwalker. But then you look, at the larger picture and how I mean, things can be manipulated here and there, and again.
Wait a second. Are you saying that he had like contractors, military industrial type contractors doing some sort of I don't know, some sort of,
non-lethal weapons testing, yes.
Oh, now that makes a lot of sense. To what end,
You know what? That is that's $1 million question, $22 million question. And that's something, that I've been really digging into, because there was about a year ago, the solicitation sheet for OSAP, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Testing Program, came out, and Bigelow was the lucky winner of the $22 million that they allocated him. But in that, you've got, it was about weapons testing, and some of that money went to Skinwalker Ranch. And what were they doing with it? Well, they most certainly weren't doing anything paranormal, because if they were doing that, there would have been equipment. They would have had, scientists there, 24/7 doing what you would do in any sort of research project like you do over in Norway, where they're actually doing scientific research to study something anomalous. But so you look at all of this, and then you look at the people that were, involved. I mean, it's very interesting. And then you also look at Utah and how much we love the military, and how we can, a lot of times we do have corruption, and we look the other way when something is happening. And so it's just been a perfect thing for me. And then you've got this big, I believe it's a psyop, you create this myth around a specific area. And that way, when something happens, people are just jumping on the bandwagon and saying, hey, wait a minute, that's this beam that came down and burned me and made me dive into an irrigation canal. Well, that was a UFO. So even if I get cancer. It was UFO. So it discredits all of this. I mean, it's just, the whole thing is so disgusting.
You touched upon a lot of things that I think are very interesting. I'd love to kind of tap into at some point. First of all, psyops, holy crap. I mean, the story that I've been laying out to you, the whole point of it is there's two major psychological components of this. The first is what we call Gresham's dynamic. And what Gresham's dynamic is where bad ethics drives good ethics out of the marketplace. It's the dark side. Okay. It's lie, deny, switch the blame, cheat, and repeat, right? That's just deceptive hyenas. They're all over the place. They're a dime a dozen, right? But you either choose not to buy from them or play ball with them if you can recognize it, or if you've got evidence on them, you take them down, sort of thing, right? So that's kind of what comes out of what you were telling me in terms of this culture that could be in all sorts of strange places on the spectrum for what the story is. I mean, you, like me, have natural curiosity. There was something that you didn't know early that led you to questioning certain things, that led you down a path. And you've seen so many different things throughout this journey, some of which align with what your instincts told you, some of which you were able to get evidence on, and some of which continue to create questions for, right? To me, one thing I've learned in my life that I hope your listeners can take away from this, there's a lot of great mysteries out there, but all mysteries can be solved. And all mysteries can be solved with due diligence and, quite frankly, the pathway of the process. That's why we have science. There's a reason why we can create computers and the information in the world that can fit in our hands, that we can fly all over the world, that we can go land a man on a rock 140,000 miles away, that we can send satellite. I mean, all of these things can be done, handled, manifested, and everything else. As incredible as that is, we can also lie, we can deceive, we can cheat, we can steal. You know what I mean? So it's like, it depends on what path you're on. Are you on the path to truth and justice, or are you on the path to deception? And to bring it full circle, isn't that Star Wars?
Right.
It's the dark side versus the light, right? I mean, is there any mystery to that?
Yeah, and I just have to say, Mario in chat just said that just to clarify that you were mentioning Bigelow, and Bigelow owned the ranch before the current owner, Brandon Fugel, who actually just is on the cover of Utah Business this month.
So yeah, these guys have got great means, I'm sure, and who knows what they're up to. I think I'm very fascinated with this whole Bigelow thing and psyops that you just mentioned, and what he could be involved with, because the military-industrial complex, I think that a lot of the answers that you seek in the ufology community have got to be somewhere in that mix, right? Right. Because if there is a massive cover-up, of course, it's got to be the military-industrial complex.
And this is the thing. I mean, the more I look at this, the more I don't think there's any cover-up. I think the only cover-up it is that we've got going on is the fact that these guys have been playing games and messing with people, and that is the cover-up. Do I think that we have crashed UFO technology? Oh, no, I don't. I really, at this moment in time, I don't. And do I think that there is something incredible that is interacting with us? Yes, I do. But I think whatever they have told us, whatever they are going to continue to try to fill us full of, like with the To the Stars crap, I mean, it's fictitious. It's look over here while we do this over here. And it's just mind blowing. And I want people to really realize that it's nonsense.
You want people to think critically.
Yes,
and you want people to have a high filter. Yeah, like I just heard you say that. I wasn't sure where you stood on some of this stuff. Like, would I be surprised that UFOs have crashed in the desert at Roswell and everything else? I wouldn't be. I would think that's a possibility in some of the other things. But the great cover-up for me, really, whether it's ufology or finance, or it's funny to say that, or anything else, it just comes from power a lot of the times. If someone can gain the upper hand and have an advantage to having information that needs to be hidden from other people, power will do that.
Yeah.
There's no question. I mean, that's what they've done throughout history.
But you also, I mean, it's like and the thing that makes me so, well, I mean, there are multiple things that make me a little upset about this, but the fact that you could take something that is supposed to be such a kind of a joyful, discovery process. We're looking for extraterrestrial life. We're looking to try to explain some of these great mysteries or things that have happened to us that are very profound. And yet we've got this group of people, decade after decade, who have promoted these false beliefs so they can do things on the down low, make money from it, and do God knows what without being really checked. And that's the thing that is, we have to find our own power again. And I think we look too many times to other people to find that power, and it's not working for us.
You know what I heard when you described that? I heard Donald Trump. I heard Donald Trump pointing the finger at election fraud when his entire business model is fraud. Yes, that's like all-star wrestling guys. That's like, Barnum and Bailey's circus. I mean, the American tradition has had con men from the very beginning. Con men could be guys at the head of the Church of Scientology. Con men could be at the head of some real estate organization. Con men could be at the head of Nexium was another one that was out there, which is, anything where people need to find something that can be manipulated. You got to be aware of predators. Let me tell you one thing about the real estate cycle that took place in the run-up to the great financial crisis that I think has a whole lot of lessons to be learned for the ufology community, especially those that are looking to find, legitimate truths that could be befuddled by a whole arena of deception for whatever reason. It's called, oh gosh, let me think of the terminology for this. Oh my gosh, the predators, they're called. Just think about people that go into churches or into organizations like Boy Scouts or into whatever the case may be. And they become strawmen, basically. They act like you're your friend, but they're setting you up to deceive you in some way. That's kind of what they're describing.
Absolutely. And that is exactly what, has taken place in ufology with the UFO community. And it's just interesting when you go to some of these conferences and you sit back and you see how these really incredible, warm-hearted people are there, and they have had experiences. They're looking for answers. And then these vultures come in and are trying to either, promote their own quackery, their religious ideologies, pushing that down people's throats, and then they're taking, telling these people what to experience, and it is like a cult-like environment. And then you've got the abduction stuff that is taking place that I definitely think has a little more earthly explanation than we've been told. But it's sad to me. And at some point in time, people in this community have got to stand up and start looking more critically at this. And then, obviously we're talking about a larger picture with this as well, but it really is a community that is really ripe for the picking as far as calling in.
I know what the terminology is that I forgot to mention, and I know that we're going to close up here in the next couple of minutes. It's called affinity fraud. Affinity fraud is like I just said, people that are in churches. Imagine people that go into churches that are part of your congregation that you think you can trust, that are literally setting you up. That happens all the time. And I'm sure that happens in the ufology community all the time. All I know is that wherever there are questions, anybody can go the distance to find the answers. But let me tell you, it's a discipline. And by the way, it takes resources. So, for example, one of the great arts of this country that is now pretty much dead because of the nature of how things work in the fractured marketplace of ideas is investigative journalism. Because investigative journalism requires resources.
Right. Absolutely. And I mean, this has been a fascinating conversation. We've touched on so many things, but this is, again, to me, it's important to look at some of the bigger things behind the scenes because it's all connected. And at the end of the day, like you said, it's about power, it's about control, it's about money. And there are, a couple handfuls of people that are really pulling one over on all of us. And that has got to stop.
Well, what's also got to stop is people being so naive to not recognizing that fact. And I love the fact that you want people to think critically because getting involved with conspiracy theory is just simply an evolution of being lazy.
Right.
Getting to the truth requires work.
It does, and Lord knows it's making me tired, but we're going to keep plugging away, and thank you for your insight and everything, and I hope we get to hang out and play some tennis soon.
I would love to.
Yeah, well, you have to prepare yourself.
I bet you're good.
Well, I've heard stories, yeah. Just kidding.
Go to, for all your viewers who want to see the truth and come to the truth and understand what's actually fractured the entire American everything, go to thecon.tv. www.thecon.tv. Yeah, we're self-distributed right now because a lot of powerful people, which own the entire apparatus of media, coming from hedge funds and private equity and Wall Street, do not want the story to be told. But I can tease you guys that we've got some very powerful people that are about to join us that are going to make a difference. And so we're going to be seeing ourselves on major platforms here in the very not too distant future.
Well, congratulations, and congratulations to Eric Vaughn, who was the writer-director. You produced this, executive producer, Adam Bronfman. How do you say his last name?
Bronfman.
Okay, well, that was good. But this is, again, like I said, this is really important. It exposes fraudulent practices through the mortgage crisis and credit card debt, all sorts of things, and it does lay a foundation for where we are now. And so I appreciate you doing that. I appreciate you taking the time to be here tonight. So thank you. I'll have you back, and stay out of trouble in the meantime.
Let's get your TV show produced. I'd love to go to Italy and all of the other exciting places with you to go meet these wonderful people around the world doing great research. It sounds like there's a lot of heavy hitters out there doing some good work.
You know what? I would love to. We've been talking about this for a long time. I think it would be great to do a show because there are so many wonderful places and incredible researchers that are really studying this, and you have to weave through the nonsense that takes place here in the United States and things, and that's kind of fun. I mean, it's not fun, who am I kidding, but it's part of the process too. So it will be a great show if we can make it happen, and I look forward to it.
Right on, my friend. Erica, it's always great to connect with you. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it.
It's great connecting with you. We'll talk soon. And I want to just thank everybody for listening to UFO Classified, for getting in here, expressing your opinions, albeit different sometimes. But you know what? That's why we're here. And I just want to say thank you to Bruce Cornett and Ken. My heart goes out to all of you who have lost loved ones. I appreciate you very much. Be safe, and we will connect next week. And I'm going to delve next week because I found some really interesting tapes, lectures over the years that were given by specific people in ufology that are throwing into the mix the religious aspect, and it is deeply disturbing to me. So I want to play some of these tapes and then go over that and get your thoughts on all of that. You can go to UFOclassified.com to pledge your support to the show, to find out who's coming on next week. Thank you, Patrick, and God bless all of you. Be safe, and we'll catch you next week.
So my skeptical mind, and that's just who I am. My skeptical mind goes to, well, yeah, of course, you've got this guy over here that's logical and reasonable, and you got this guy over here that's wearing a tinfoil hat. Of course the tinfoil hat guy's going to see a lot of stuff, right? He's like imagining it, or he's watched one too many sci-fi movies.
But it's used to help us frame hypotheses for UFO propulsion, power, stealth, weaponry.
Everything that we experience is very positive.
Sometimes the field of ufology has a short memory span.
We didn't know anything about the $22 million back then. We just kind of thought, well, this is, and I think that was the reason why they were looking for military-type people, because in the military, you work with whatever you got.